I want to talk about a fight which I believe is potentially one of the most exciting encounters to be had in the heavyweight division. It's a fight that I didn't expect, but it's a fight that's looking very, very increasingly likely, and that's the potential matchup between Alexander Povetkin and Mike Perez. Just to set the scene for this fight, Bryant Jennings was scheduled to face the winner of the Wilder-Stiverne fight taking place in January. The WBC had been quite clear that given the fact they were extremely lax with enforcing mandatories on Vitaly Klitschko throughout his reign as WBC champion, and given the fact that there hadn't been very many WBC heavyweight title fights lately, that they were going to be quite efficient and ruthless with regard to enforcing mandatories. What they did was have the Stiverne versus Areola fight for the vacant title. They had Wilder versus Malik Scott as a final eliminator, and Mike Perez versus Bryant Jennings as a semi-final eliminator. What a semi-final eliminator meant is not that you get to face the champion in his next fight, but you must face the champion in the fight after that. So as a result, Bryant Jennings had to face the winner of Stiverne Wilder, and Stiverne Wilder wouldn't be able to face anyone as a voluntary until they'd faced Bryant Jennings. What it looks like now is that Bryant Jennings will be offered a voluntary challenge to face Vladimir Klitschko. It is highly likely that he will accept that challenge. Personally, I feel it's come quickly for him. I feel he's got a higher chance against Wilder or Stiverne, whichever one it may be. But I understand financials are at play. Chris Areola, for example, reportedly received $80,000 for facing Stiverne. Whereas we know Klitschko opponents get rewarded often, we'd expect Jennings to run around the $2 million mark. So if we say Stiverne beats Wilder, which I think is possibly the more likely outcome of the two, but even if Wilder beats Stiverne, the payday awaiting Bryant Jennings is not life-changing. It may not even be six figures before he's got to pay his trainer, his promoter, his sparring partners, etc. Whereas should he face Vladimir Klitschko, not only is he getting a chance to beat the number one man, but he's also getting a life-changing payday. Instinct is that Bryant Jennings will go down the Klitschko route, even though it's a more difficult fight. This would mean a situation, and the WBC commented on this in their convention, they would still enforce a mandatory on the Stiverne Wilder winner. What they would do is call an eliminator between the two fighters next in line in their rankings, which would be Alexander Povetkin and would be Mike Perez. So effectively, if the Klitschko-Jennings fight goes ahead, which it looks like it will do, we can expect this fight as a final eliminator to face the winner of Wilder-Stiverne. This fight's really interesting. Povetkin would certainly be the favourite. Povetkin is widely considered as the number 2 heavyweight after Vladimir Klitschko. We know he had an extended spell as the WBA regular champion, and to be fair to him, during that time, he beat some opposition that's noteworthy. Just having a look briefly at his record, he knocked out Chris Bird. He beat Eddie Chambers by unanimous decision. He beat Ruslan Chagayev by unanimous decision, who is the current incumbent of the WBA regular belt. He beat Marco Huck. He knocked out an old Hasim Rahman. We know what happened with the Vladimir Klitschko fight. He performed with credit, albeit in a one-sided loss. But since returning from that Vladimir Klitschko fight, I've been quite impressed with the level of opposition Povetkin's been in with. He hasn't taken an easy way back. He hasn't fought 5 or 6 journeymen. His comeback fight was against Manuel Char, who at the time only had 1 loss on his record, and he stopped Char in the 7th round, knocked him out. He then fought Carlos Takam, which I thought was a very, very strange fight because I thought Takam was really good. and I didn't see the risk reward being there for Povetkin. So huge credit to Povetkin for taking a fight as difficult as that. Without Takam having the sort of celebrity and the name. But again, he stopped Takam. And in these fights, Povetkin has shown real toughness, lasting the distance with Klitschko. He's also shown real power, one-punch knockouts of the likes of Char, Takam, guys who haven't had problems with their durability in the past. So I think, Povetkin remains at the very top of the heavyweight division. I certainly have him at the minute above the likes of Kubrat Pulev, Bryant Jennings, probably even above the likes of Bermane Stiverne for me. I rate him very highly indeed. He's a good fighter. Concerns are, he's 6'2", he's always going to be on the small side in the age of super heavyweights. And the other concern is the fact that he's 35. He's not a young man, and he needs to be in tough fights, and he needs to work his way back up quickly. You don't want it to take 3 or 4 years for him to work his way back to a title shot. So perhaps that's why he's so open to taking these tough matchups against the likes of Char, the likes of Takam, etc. Given the level of opposition he's taken on throughout his career, it would be surprising. I don't see Povetkin ducking a Mike Perez fight whatsoever. Now, from Perez's side, he was unsuccessful last time he was in the ring in a big fight, where he was outpointed by Bryant Jennings. That fight was controversial. Perez was docked a dubious point in that fight, a point that would have made the difference. It was very tight. But Perez would clearly jump at the opportunity to be in a world title final eliminator, given the fact that he's coming off a loss. Perez is one of those guys, like Povetkin, he's not the tallest guy out there, he's not the biggest heavyweight out there. And arguably that is a concern in terms of him reaching the absolute pinnacle of the heavyweight division. I also question whether Perez has, I don't question, I seriously doubt that Perez is in possession of the heavy one-punch knockout power possessed by the likes of Povetkin, or Wilder, or Stiverne, or Klitschko, or Hay. He's not one of those fighters for me. But what Stiverne brings to the table is twofold. Impeccable technical pedigree with his Cuban amateur background, combined with quite impressive durability. Mike Perez is one of the most iron chins out there. The Magomed Abdusalamov fight, we now know that fight ended with tragic circumstances. But I remember watching that fight at the time, before we knew how Magomed's injuries would transpire. And I remember being so impressed that Perez was able to take the shots that came his way in what was an absolute war from an unbeaten fighter at the time in Abdusalamov, who was known as a heavy-handed knockout artist. Perez is a tough guy, very durable, iron chin. I've followed him ever since he won Prize Fighter. I've seen the majority of his fights, and he is not a guy any heavyweight out there is going to be easy to stop. In the Bryant Jennings fight, I pretty much scored Perez the first half of the fight and Jennings the second half of the fight. In my opinion, Perez was taking Jennings to school in the early parts. Jennings, to my eye, could not deal with Perez's positioning in the ring, with Perez's head movement. Perez's jab was a constant and effective threat in the first part of that fight. For me, he was clearly superior in terms of capabilities and in terms of technical pedigree to Jennings. Jennings doesn't have much of an amateur background, and for me, Perez really was taking him to school in the early rounds. What happened with Perez, unfortunately, was the ill discipline and poor training exposed a lack of stamina, and towards the end of the fight he became very low volume, very laboured, very stationary, and allowed Bryant Jennings to win points and to win the fight. I personally scored it a draw. but I can't argue with the decision given the point deduction, which I thought was harsh. My point is that Perez does have some issues in terms of conditioning, in terms of stamina, in terms of output. But as a technician, he's top level. I mean, if we look at the Carlos Takam fight, similar story in that fight. Perez wins the first half of the fight, Takam wins the second half of the fight. He is open to being worn down towards the end of the fight and losing rounds. And against Povetkin, who himself, let's not forget, Povetkin's an Olympic gold medalist winner, outstanding athlete, outstanding amateur. We also know Povetkin can fight late on into a fight. He went 12 with Klitschko. He stopped Takam in round 10. He stopped Char in round 7. Clearly this is a guy who can pose a threat late on in a fight. He's not just heavy-handed in the first round or two. He's a guy who comes on. That is a concern. Clearly Perez needs to come to this fight in shape, in good condition, and prepared for the biggest fight of his life. But we know these days he's training with Robert Garcia. Anyone who watches Ellie Sexbach's channel, ES News, will see recent footage that he's been in the gym very, very regularly, that he's working hard. And if under Robert Garcia he can change his ways, I know he's flitted from trainer to trainer, I know he's with Alan Booth, I know he was with James Ali Vasir, but if he can find his home with Robert Garcia, if he can recognise that his lack of stamina, his lack of training and conditioning has cost him previously, and rectify that, then he's a threat to all out there. Now Povetkin is not going to be exposed in the same way Jennings was in the first few rounds against Perez. In my eyes, Povetkin is a more advanced fighter than Jennings. Certainly Povetkin has the amateur pedigree and capability that Jennings doesn't have. I don't think Perez's jab is going to cause as many issues for Povetkin as it did for Jennings. I don't think Perez's positioning and angles are going to cause as much difficulty for Povetkin. But I'm yet to see someone come and outwork Perez in the first few rounds of a fight. Abdusalamov didn't do it. Jennings didn't do it. Takam didn't do it. Povetkin's better than those guys. But for my eyes, Povetkin himself can be outworked and outboxed. Obviously we saw that happen in the Klitschko fight, but I'd urge everyone to look at the Carlos Takam fight. There's a phrase that Dwyer likes to use, knockouts cause amnesia. Let's not forget, that Takam fight was very, very tight. It was a real close competitive fight. Takam's jab and Takam's movement were very, very effective in the early part of that fight. And Takam, I'd say it was pretty even before the stoppage. Povetkin wasn't exactly, if he was ahead, it was by one round. It was a close fight. Takam's jab really was a weapon. He was working well on the outside. Now, if Carlos Takam can have that success against Povetkin, and if we remember how well, in my opinion, Perez took the first 5 rounds of the Perez-Carlos Takam fight. So if Carlos Takam can outwork Povetkin and be very competitive in a fight with Povetkin by using jab and by using boxing, surely Mike Perez can do it. The question is, we know Povetkin is a threat into the late rounds of a fight. We know he's very heavy-handed. We know he comes on strong, and unlike Perez, he's proven he can fight for 12 rounds. So the question to my eye is what kind of shape Mike Perez turns up in. Because if he takes training with Robert Garcia seriously, if he turns up in peak physical condition, I genuinely, wholeheartedly believe he can beat Alexander Povetkin. Perez isn't a great knockout artist at the top level. Yes, in prize fight he was knocking people over left, right and centre, but at the elite level he isn't a heavy-handed fighter to my idea. Now, with Povetkin, he's extremely, extremely durable. We saw that against Klitschko. He took huge punishment in that fight, but stayed strong, kept coming, kept fighting. Now, to my eyes, it's going to be very difficult for Perez to stop Povetkin. Povetkin's too durable. Perez doesn't have the punching power. But I also think it's going to be very, very hard for Povetkin to stop Perez. We know Povetkin punches very, very hard. And we know he's a threat throughout the course of the fight. But Perez has got an iron chin and is very, very durable. I wouldn't totally discount a Perez late stoppage. A Povetkin late stoppage. I wouldn't totally discount Povetkin knocking out Perez late on in the fight if Perez's stamina stops. Because if Perez gets to the point where he's so tired and he's vulnerable, Povetkin is still a threat and so heavy-handed that he could knock Perez out late on in the fight. But my suspicion at this point is that if we can consider both guys' durability, that it is more likely than not that this fight will go to points. It's so easy for someone to say, oh, Povetkin will walk through him, knock him out. But Perez doesn't get knocked out. And if Povetkin does knock him out, it would be very, very impressive. I think this fight is more likely to go points than KO. Clearly it depends on Perez's conditioning. But we've seen Perez outbox, out-hustle top 10 guys like Takam and Jennings in the first half of a fight. We've also seen Povetkin lose rounds early to a jab and to boxing by a fighter like Carlos Takam, obviously by Vladimir Klitschko. And I think if Perez comes in peak condition, on form, I think he can win the first half of the fight against Povetkin. And I think in what would be a very competitive, very entertaining, very exciting fight, I would possibly lean towards Perez to win by points. I rate him that highly. And I don't think Povetkin has the height and the sort of range to be able to quell Perez's attack. As I say, Perez has given us reason to doubt him. And if Perez turns up in anything less than 100% peak condition, and if he's anything less than 100% dedicated to boxing, we know what Povetkin can do to you. And Perez won't be able to walk around for 3 or 4 rounds out of gas like he did against Jennings, because Povetkin poses too much of an offensive threat. But I see this as a 50-50 fight, and I'd lean slightly to Mike Perez. I appreciate that should this fight be made, Povetkin will probably be an overwhelming favourite. I know he's rated extremely highly on BoxRec, on the forums, on YouTube. I know Perez is not rated so highly, and people think he's too small to be a heavyweight. But against Povetkin, he's up against a very small heavyweight also. A heavyweight who is susceptible to a jab, to ring positioning, and a heavyweight who has lost rounds to, in my opinion, a lesser technician in Carlos Takam. Don't count Mike Perez out. Let me know your thoughts. The one other thing I'd say is, Perez has got through life as an amateur star, a very, very highly rated prospect. He's now in a position where he's lost his unbeaten record. This could go one of 2 ways. He could accept the fact that he won't get to the top, and accept the fact that he's going to be used as an opponent in future. Or it could be the kick up his arse that he needed. It could be the reason why he's changed trainers. It could be the reason why he's been seen in the gym so regularly recently. And if that change of attitude is present, he's a threat to all, including a fighter as good as Povetkin. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.